In which case, thanks for joining us all for the last session of the day. We have a panel here titled The Guardians of the Digital Realm. I think someone's been watching some Marvel. The crucial role of accreditation and certification in cybersecurity, which is a topic that comes up quite a bit, both from the perspective of organisations procuring services, but also when I'm engaging with people fresh out of university or new to the industry, trying to work out how they get in, right? And so we've got three panelists here with me. We have Andrew, who's the strategy director at CyberScheme. Thank you for joining us, Andrew. We have Chris Gray from Co-op Bank, who's a CISO. Yeah, fantastic. And Stu, who's one of our principal consultants, but Stu's been in the certification part of this industry for, well, he was doing it long before I arrived, and I've been here a decade now, so he's got a lot of deep experience on this topic, quite apart from his red team pedigree. So I'm hoping between the panelists we've got here, we've got some quite good discussions to have. So first off, I think one of the core reasons that drives certification in any industry is a need for industry standards, best practices, sort of professionalising the industry and taking it away from its DEFCON Vegas party roots and into something that regulators can get behind. So I'll open it up to whoever wants to speak first. Really, what do we think? Or what role does certification play in helping us establish that professionalism and really take the industry to that next level?
It's probably worth introducing the direction and travel we've been over the last 3 years. The UK government has got 90 plus regulators in operation, and there's not a consistent standard between any of them in terms of how they approach cybersecurity or as cybersecurity professional with. So as part of the National Strategic Review, the last one and previous government was the decision to start thinking about putting a profession in place. And that was the launch of the UK Cybersecurity Council. Now that's not to undermine existing certifications, knowledge and all the rest of it. It's starting to bring to bear the concept that irrespective of what body you're in and what regulatory, you can point to something that gives you some confidence that that's an alignment across the profession. So I think regulators only exist for the reason of public safety. And as part of that, it is the knowledge, the competence, and the way they safely prosecute their job. So we know it's health, we know it's law, we know all the sectors that are regulated for those reasons. With secure financial services sector, Competition Markets and Authorities, that FCA can insist on skilled persons. It has a regulatory responsibility. So some of that has been addressed, but that's not consistent across all regulated bodies.
I don't mind going next. I think I have to put the disclaimer that the views expressed now of my own and do not necessarily represent that of the bank. It's been kind of something recorded. So career limitation disclaimer done. So I've kind of seen it from all sides. I used to be clever once and was a pen tester. And so I had to go through kind of the accreditation probably in the early days, kind of when Crest was starting. And we're first seeing that. Then later I've gone on as helping people, who you mentioned, coming out of university, building their careers, as well as having to procure services from partners, working with regulators who were looking for that. And I think for me, while there is no perfect answer, one of the key things is having a common language. And I guess if you see in other industries, if you go to the doctor, you probably don't mind what university they've been to, or even potentially what jurisdiction they come from internationally. If they've got a level of certification, you're probably not too worried about them working with yourself. And I think that's what I kind of see it with cyber. There's so many different aspects to it. You can't sit down and have an in-depth conversation with every single person about, are they the right person to engage with, the right partner to engage with their organization. But certification helps start to set that baseline field. Okay, I expect, of course, there is a probably later question about what you expect, but you're going to expect a level of either like competence, professionalism, or accreditation or coverage. You're dealing with regulators. When you can go out and say that we're comfortable, we understand the level of competence that's come from this.
And so how do you think that is positioned from us as a vendor providing these services, and where does that fit in with what we've heard here from the other end of the spectrum?
I think my answer is actually quite an intuitive one, which is going off what Chris just said. People the people who buy services from WithSecure, so for me, I'm a regulated red teamer for a living, you need to be confident that the standard that we deliver is at or above a minimum level. And there is simply no way to do that by individually interviewing every single person. There needs to be a shortcut to that. And I think for me, the requirement to have that is one of the only real ways to demonstrate that to you. Otherwise, there is no consistent benchmark. And I think we'll come on later to exactly the techniques and how we do that and which bits work and which bits don't. But otherwise, I'll just be repeating what these guys have said. So I'll stop talking now in the interest of you getting drinks earlier.
Fair enough. Cheers, Stu. So, I mean, one of the obvious places that this has come in so far, I mean, back in the day, obviously Check's been running for a while. One of the more interesting ones, to me at least, is in the context of regulated red teaming, particularly in the financial sector, but we're seeing it in telecoms and all the rest of it. And personally, given my experience in Europe, it's been interesting seeing what's happening now as they're learning from what's happened in the UK. They're a few years behind, So I'd be particularly keen to hear your thoughts, Chris, given your role in the bank.
Yeah, I do think so. And consciously, there are lots of certifications and accreditation. We don't particularly want to go in on any, but you mentioned at the beginning kind of CBEST. I was involved as both working in a financial services, but procuring services and working with the regulator. I think you mentioned about the maturity that kind of drove, and I think that really did help. There were plenty of certifications and accreditations around before that, but putting a regulatory body behind it, plus bringing in experts from the industry, which included kind of part like WithSecure, to formulate what a combined approach, but level of competence and capabilities would be, was really probably game-changing. A lot of people kind of got accreditation because they said, I have to have this for applying for the job. But now I can't actually go off and do certain types of work and potentially really interesting work because the regulator really pushing CBEST to this kind of red team on steroids, really advanced testing. One of the things I think you do need to be careful with, and I think CBEST saw that, is they wanted to really set a high benchmark. And I think there was only about 3 people in the country who'd done enough hours who were able to apply to be accredited. There is an element of, you might want to have a really rigorous process, but you've also got to make it achievable. And it's also got to be scalable because you can't tell a lot of organizations you must do something with certain people and then say, there's a shortage of those people or those firms in the industry to do it.
It is the classic conundrum, because if you look at the financial sector, I mean, the 52 licensed financial management institutions. But if you tell every single one of them that they have a CBEST test done every year, question to the FCA, well, how many testers do you need then? And at what level? And what is the quantity you're asking for? It's easy dealing with just critical economic function. We've got a very narrow optic on large-scale harms, but the harms run through the stack. So there is a little bit of addressing that. But that is just one sector. As I said, what are we doing with the other 90? So the financial sector doesn't care whether it gets power, does it? Or does it?
Question. But I think to your point as well, if there's a measure of success with things like ICO, it's probably then the adoption elsewhere and internationally as well, because it starts up in the UK, but very quickly, any testers or firms that were doing testing or firms that had been tested, international regulators say, well, actually, we now think that's quite a good baseline. So if you do, get it right, then it makes it a lot easier to roll out and for people to want to adopt. And I guess that's a good measure of success.
And Stuart, I'll be keen to hear your thoughts on this, actually. So one of the things I've noticed dealing with a couple of different regulators is that some of them are much stricter on which certifications they allow than others. CBEST is quite rigorous in it being very limited originally in what it accepted for its staff delivering the engagements, right? Whereas some of the international ones are less so. So, how do you think that plays out?
Well, that's an interesting one to unpick. This could be the subject of 2 hours that we don't have in itself. I think one of, perhaps speaking openly, my criticisms of the way this has happened is, in my view, we seem to have started with a solution, which is an exam of some sort. And then we're now trying to make the problem fit it, which is we need something, and the solution is this examination process that we go through. So every 3 years, for those who've been assessed by me, I apologize, but every 3 years you turn up to an exam room or now to Pearson VUE and you do this exam and then you're sent away for 3 years. And what's interesting to me is that other regulated industries that are involved in any sort of vocational subject, so from personal experience, aviation and healthcare, there are plenty of others, don't actually validate their staff like that. So in order to qualify, for example, as an ambulance paramedic, you have to pass some exams, but you don't go back 2 years later and just do all those exams again. There is another method of demonstrating continuous competence, which is something that I know the cyber scheme are doing more of now. But that I think is the direction of where we need to go, because the idea of just demonstrating competence by repeating something you did 2 years ago completely abstractly is actually not grounded in evidence. It's certainly not grounded in educational evidence. And the regulated qualifications framework under Ofqual do not, that isn't how other validated qualifications are maintained. And so I think the different regulators who have listed different qualifications may have somewhat understandably fallen into this trap of, we need to have qualifications, we need to do them every so often, so let's pick some that may or may not be suitable. And that's a separate discussion over during later as to which ones are and which ones might not be. But I think fundamentally it's just been approached from completely the wrong place. It's not how other regulated, validated industries do things. And I do think that the future of it isn't going to be grounded in repeated, isolated examination cycles, because it's not the right way of collecting evidence of competence. And I say that having written some of these exams.
I think it can very quickly become a quick way to just achieve some kind of, whether it's compliance and a couple of examples that you gave there. If people get behind something, which is always good if people get behind something as kind of that shared mind, but it's going to take a long time to see that rolled out. What was right 4 years ago won't be right today. And can you say everybody is on the same place if they've all kind of crossed those kind of different paths? I think that's kind of really important. And it's the way things move on. I mean, we've not mentioned much about AI, because other than the talk, but I was positive, I think, in many ways about the kind of the way where we can use that in a slightly different way. But cars could go drive themselves. So is a driving test the right thing in the future, given the fact how long it'll take government to change the way we're currently assessed the ability to drive? After, I just sat and injected some dodgy prompts into my DAB radio while I'm driving along, and before I know it, I don't know where I'm going. So it's keeping up with the changes. And actually, I think one of the big challenges can be, it takes a long time to get a framework in place that's workable. Yeah. But it also needs to evolve, otherwise it becomes too stagnant.
And in some respects, chartered institutes have been around for, hundreds of years, level 40, those sort of dates. But of late, the concept is mostly about the ability to measure individual competence within the profession. It doesn't, it's agnostic to where you've studied, how you've studied, what you've studied. It measures whether you are competent at a level to practice. That's all it seeks to achieve there. And as Stuart points out, and part of that intrinsically, like it is with the IET and the others, is a measured commitment to professional development that has some value and some merit that can at least be assessed and measured. So instead of the exams, you demonstrate how your commitment to CPD, what you've done and how that's done as part of your professional membership. It's a very different approach. And not one that most of us are used to, because it's been easier just to go and tick the box. Although, as we've said before, I worked with a multinational company a while back, and I worked out for most of our security tests, we need 11 different certifications to be able to trade in 4 jurisdictions. And that was clearly mad, given it was exactly the same topic. It was just security testing. There were different certifications all over the place. And it goes back to your point, they all cherry pick one, and then that's where you're stuck as a business, trying to drive that forward.
So I think that definitely addresses one of the challenges that we're facing in this space, which is that there's no international agreement from the regulators on of what good looks like here. But what do you think are some of the other challenges that we're running into in trying to develop these certification, sort of professional certification schemes?
It does deal with pace. We listened to lots of very, very good presentations this morning, and you look at the challenges and the problems that are coming out. and the problem solving. And as Stuart has said, I mean, I have a bit of a breakdown in academia. I was talking to King's College the other day, and I said, you need to shift to problem-based learning for your degree syllabus. Don't write something down. Problem-based learning is where you've got to be over 3 years to make them more relevant to the marketplace. So we have to shift academia, we have to shift education, we have to shift appetites. All of it has to start to move.
I think also the certification process in isolation is probably not the right solution for everything it's trying to solve. And this will, I know there's another topic all over this, which is to do with accreditation, so chartership, etc. And for me, that's the other half of this, because that's all about accountability and consequence. So sometimes we use certifications to demonstrate competence in doing something, which is fine. But we sometimes also use it as a way of holding people accountable, and it's simply not designed to do that. And in other industries, people are regulators, people are registered. And again, I use the example of both aviation and health. Professionals appear on a register. They are accountable publicly for that. Any misdemeanors or malpractice is publicly shown. If you look at the Healthcare Professions Council, you can actually look up what paramedics and physios have done, and some of them have been completely stupid. But their ability to practice in that form will depend on their behaviour. And if there are any problems, that can be publicly seen. And it's a form of open justice, if you want to look at it like that. Mm-hmm. In this industry, before chartership, that doesn't exist. So the industry uses certifications as a surrogate for that. So as long as you're qualified, it should be okay. But actually, as it stands at the moment, other than internal organisationally, there isn't really any consequence. And holding testers, like myself and the others who spoke, and holding us professionally to account is something that in this industry is missing, and certifications are not the answer for it on their own. There has to be personal accountability with it, which I think is where chartership is being used. And the aggregation of those two things actually brings us in line with other regulated institutions, most others certainly in the UK.
I think a couple of interesting points there. So looking at challenges still, and I am end users. It's not very often I support kind of, our partner side, but there is an element of investment. If you've got to have every single person you're going to have working in the industry accredited, that's a huge investment in time, else kind of going through. But equally as well, we have seen in the land of litigation in America, there have been people in firms privately pursued for negligence in cyber, going back to what we said about medical practice. So in some ways, having a level where you can say, well, I was qualified for the job honest, is a good thing to at least be able to open your opening kind of argument in court on. So I do think there's those elements. The other key thing, I think, and it's going to be a bit of a race here, is cyber, we're seeing more and more, can have an effect in the outside world. A long time ago, maybe you broke someone's computer with a Word document on it. Now you can impact pacemakers with a ransomware attack. So there's threats to life. And once you get to that point, you end up into the aviation, the medical professional. The reason they're so tightly regulated is because of those risks. And it's not going to be that long. Well, it already exists now, but before we see the cyber world really interfering with the physical world.
The principle, I think, and this is a little bit of forecasting, is that cyber is not a regulated profession, but there are some of the indicators that demonstrate it may well have to be as professionals, so only because of the increasing harms that are starting to materialize, which are quite significant. The other aspect of governance responsibility, which is fundamentally as insurer of last resort, it wants central banking economic stability because it doesn't want to spend another £240 billion bailing banks out. It's a simple truth, and that was the same in America, same everywhere else. They want it because they don't want to have to do that again as government, because the taxpayer ends up paying that bill. So there is that element. It's the starting gun of trying to move in that direction. Nobody should fear chartership if they have the competence and experience in the background, and nobody should seek it unless they have it. It's a case of a pathway. Do not feel undervalued if you come in as a practitioner within a profession or a principal to get to chartered. It's a pathway, and then it's your career. because it's not about your business and your companies, unfortunately, and it's about personal professional development, and you can migrate between private and public sector. So the UK government is committed to shift its entire cyber and digital workforce to chartership, and it will cost a lot of money and it will take a lot of time. But as we've probably seen, paying the bill sometimes becomes a thing that has to be done.
Yeah. So I'm curious then, we've spoken quite a lot about chartership being the future here and how we need to shift to a more continuous professional development model that doesn't rely on purely certifying people by the same thing every 3 years or what have you. And what other trends do we see emerging in this space? Where else do we think cybersecurity certification is going to evolve over the foreseeable future?
There's still an element of reconciling where we are with other chartered institutes like BCS and IET, because there are still some fundamental issues and flaws. So there's an evolution. Cyber has generated an evolution now in the discipline. We heard a little bit earlier on. It was about the speed, the pace at which we operate, the use of open source coding, the use of all these principles. And AI is obviously a really good example of how do we evolve it at pace to benefit with low risk. That's a completely different mindset. I had a partner, one of my friend's sons had a daughter, and they were talking about how pleased he was. And the first thing I bought her when she was 1 year old was the basic handbook to quantum theory. I said, because by the time she's 18, you need to be obsolete. If you're helping with your GCE maths, you're over here. I said, I'm thinking that's your problem. That's not my problem. I'm going to hopefully be retired. But that is going to be your problem. That's the reality of the world. And that's the thing we've got a problem with. We've got to bring everybody along. Because if we can't bring the engineering community and the software development community and the professional services community that manage those services along at the same pace, then actually we're just a satellite again, just beaconing out messages that nobody does anything about.
Yeah, I think for me as well, going almost a little bit back to CBEST, but then you mentioned things like charter. I think it's that range. So for me, when I kind of started out testing, the certifications as they were, we'll name no names, but many of you are probably thinking the same thing, were multiple choice exercises where you couldn't know how to touch a computer but would probably pass it. And there was an element of, we really saw that kind of evolution to being able to demonstrate actual competence with some of the other exams and certifications that came along. And that was really good. But I guess to me, that stays very much in the technical perspective. I imagine for any of us here who are unfortunately in management, we don't get to spend as much time playing with the fancy technology. I'm acutely aware of what should I be doing for professional development. Because it wouldn't make sense for me to get a deeply technical pen testing certification now, but it also probably won't look good in long term if organizations can't demonstrate professionalism and competence by having individuals that have demonstrated kind of commitment to industry standards, best practice, and doing the right thing. So I'm really interested to kind of see it more accessible and maybe more or better known, I'll say, management certification ones that don't just focus purely on kind of technical element.
No, I think that's a very valid point. Certainly when I've been doing my research on this, the technical testing, can you hack stuff? Certs are, I'm not going to say a dime a dozen these days, but there's certainly plenty of. Whereas when you start moving into the cybersecurity leadership space, there are certainly a lot more gaps where everyone's relying on the same few certifications to certify across a very wide spectrum of duties and roles.
I think for the person or people like the kind of responsibility, I don't mean about if you're a really, really good technical tester, that's probably different if you're in a regulated entity, whether that's financial or carrying accountability for whether it's people's safety of data, safety of their health, safety of other things. And so it's all good and well of an incredibly qualified person looking for a threatened system, person responsible overall for people's safety, data safety, that isn't going to a similar level of...
No, and I think it's part of the focus. I mean, slight personal bias here, but Stuart has been involved with this on developing an entirely new approach to red team management. And that approach is fundamentally rooted in human qualities of critical thinking, judgment, not just technical skill. It is literally driven by being in the thought processes and the thought space of both the client, both tactically and strategically, as well as the business and the industry, how best to use teams, where the gaps are, and to be able to present something and be accountable for it, completely accountable for the outcomes that come with it.
I think fundamentally there's a thing here about different assessment methods, which is where all this comes from. And what we've tended to default to are methods of gathering evidence that we are very familiar with. So written papers, multiple choice exams, practical labs, because we're all quite comfortable intuitively with the idea of them. But the next stage of this, going back to Nick's earlier question, is you accepting different assessment techniques. So as a very crude, simple example, if you were looking to certify someone for driving, someone writing down what they would do in an essay form wouldn't be credible evidence. And in education, if you're interested in the research for it, there's a whole series of principles, so VARCs, valid, authentic, current, sufficient, reliable. There are different ways of measuring and testing evidence. And I think and I'm part of this problem, we have fallen previously into this idea of we've got multiple choice, we've got labs, we've got written exams, plus minus interviews. Let's use those because those are the ones available and construct something that we can get away with. And everything I say is not meant to be just this sort of resounding flying flag for chartership. But I think what it does is it changes the strength of the other evidence that can be provided. So when you speak to a bunch of pen testers about things like CPD, automatically the mindset of how do I make this as easy as possible, turn up and write something, and there you go, I'm recerted, I'm revalidated. And that's understandable. And it was initially my thought, because it's a very easy thing to do and it gets you out of having to prove you're any good. But actually, if the evidence is being provided by someone who has a professional registration and there are consequences for that not being correct, and that's directly attributable, your public career, your ability to work depends on your reputation and will be harmed by this, that changes everything. And suddenly the opportunities for others to provide evidence of competence through having seen you do it. Anyone who's done anything in health will have a practice assessment document, which is exactly that. You have to prove that you can do the job in front of someone else for real. And there is no reason that assessment technique can't be used here. We just don't at the moment because there isn't a reliable framework for doing it. But that should come. And in terms of your question for the future, I think that's the only logical way of moving this industry into something that's validated.
And I think it's important to note, though, although I mentioned it several times, because I just happened to be involved in it, what you have to remember is that a chartered individual just gives you assurance at a specific level. You as businesses, how you employ them, there may be more they still need to do, but the gap should be shorter. There is things like cultural fit. In other words, are you the right type of person for my business? Or do you have these other specific things? And your CPD may have driven you there and said, yes, I'm a chartered scout, but I have actually spent the last years professionalizing in, let's say AI. I do nothing. I've done AI. I've done the human factors of AI. I've done all of the various bits. So as a chartered security tester, my last year has been spent doing that. And I can tell that to an employer. If that's what the employer needs, great. They don't have to worry about whether they've got any competence to do the other bits, because there's a professional body that is on them all the time wanting evidence as part of their professional commitment to the industry.
And I think, Caden had talked before, mentioned, didn't he? Sometimes at the beginning of an engagement, we need a pen test program as quickly as possible, right? Just get someone who's got some
absolutely.
It's a quick way of solving the problem, but sitting down with your kind of partners and this is what we're looking to build. What's the best way of approaching this? Isn't just I need a certificate. It's going to be experience. It's going to be various other things. And I guess we have touched on this, but some of the most regulated industries in the world aren't perfect. So, finance, you mentioned you have to be a chartered accountant to do anything, yet there's plenty of examples of financial crisis of organisations full of chartered accountants signing off organisations that weren't going to be a going concern. And we've mentioned aviation. I think probably the most regulated, or one of the most regulated aviation, they still managed to create software that, caused threat to life and obviously a big impact in two cases. So in its own, it doesn't work, but it's part of a toolkit for whether it's an individual, an organisation, or a regulatory body, or something to use as part of gaining confidence in their approach to managing cyber risk.
So the one thing that strikes me with all of this is that, I'm not saying I'm against it and by any means, but one of the things that I was driving at in my talk earlier was that security currently costs too much.
Yes.
Wow, this all sounds quite expensive.
well, I suppose, but if you said that to a doctor, then he's just spent £68,000 getting through his blah, 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 blahs, Relatively, yes. Relatively, no. So when we talk about the expense of things, the optimal model is to try and make this as cost effective as possible within a professional framework. That's certainly the direction it should be going. Should you have to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds as a business trying to get people certified? Not as much if the people are actually investing in themselves along the route. So many do. Certainly in the other professions, they get very little support from their businesses. They do it because they have to be professional. And that means the entry point to the profession, is brought down. So to maintain status on the register with the UK Cyber Council costs you £99 a year. How you do your CPD is up to you and how much you spend on that CPD, but it still needs to meet a quality bar.
I think there'd be an element of almost modularity to it as well. You are right. I think it was a really good point to be like, if a small company, if you just run one corner shop, you're probably not going to spend £100,000 on a red team, for that shop. But I guess, some analogies might be an electrician to come and change a light in your house might have a certification. You're building a power station, you'd have many different certifications, lots of different bodies, and that's where the cost would come in, but the project would be bigger. So there'll be an element of, there's going to be that element that has to fit it appropriately as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the one challenge that I think will be interesting is balancing that with the constant messaging around where we've got a shortage of good cyber people. We need to get more people in from a diverse background of all of these things. And now at the same time, obviously, this is definitely the direction things should move in. But there's an interesting balance to make there. I think I'd be keen to hear if anyone's got any thoughts on that.
The other thing I would add, and again, we're not going into any particular detail of certifications, but anybody who followed the news, there was a real push for a particular type of certification that maybe drove the wrong behaviours in helping people pass the exam. I'll say no more. Search the register if you want to. But obviously that was a drive in trying to gain more people in the industry with a particular type of certification. And rather than driving the outcome we're talking about, which is more professionalism and higher capability, it found behaviours to get the outcome without benefit.
I think it's partially, I'll go back to the university analogy because, those are still paying their university fees off, apologies, but mostly probably invested £40,000-50,000 in that journey. And then to come out at the end of it with a master's degree in cybersecurity or a bachelor's and not be able to get a job, having spent £50,000, doesn't see value for money in any shape or form. So is it a lack of, or is it the buyers and the procurers that are creating the dynamic? So the closer we can get that bit to delivering something that buyers understand, as I'd often refer to it, is most people only want ready cooked. Quite a lot of service type roles have been outsourced. A lot of the MSPs outsource a lot of the basic roles. Really big companies, there's only 8,000 of them with more than 250 employees in the UK. So how many grads can 8,000 companies take? It's not a huge number. So we've created a sequence of gaps. And not only is a lack of talent, there's a lack of, it's just, they don't
Connections aren't there.
The connections aren't there.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point. You've got to make coming in accessible because you can't say, we will. You must be certified to do the work. Okay, I'm not certified. Well, then you can never do the work. There has to be those kind of paths that are created and brought in, and that kind of requires a real support in the industry. But equally, you've got to be aware that we've all probably seen the odd CV pass our desk with someone with more certification than any existed. Yeah, a few words of conversation later, you're not 100% sure that the person who knows security quite as well as a certification would suggest.
But if you pick a route that has a number of domains, better use check, right, rather than pick on any other. Check is 8 domains of knowledge with 144 subdomains of knowledge, and if you go to a check exam, you'll get tested on about 2%. But you're meant to have it all. That's how the system works. So it says you've got that. If you're a check tester, you've got all of those domains of knowledge and all that experience, haven't you? And actually, go back to your point, when you actually have a conversation, you go, well, no, I can do that bit.
Yeah.
I know how to do that bit. And that's part of the challenge, is that sometimes it's too wide. The US, nice, when it comes to careers framework, how many careers frameworks do we need for the same thing globally? That's the problem with interoperability. But the US NICE system is quite good. They use KSAT, with It's the knowledge, the skill, and the abilities to deliver tasks. Don't have any more knowledge or skill or ability to deliver the task than you need, unless you need to deliver multiple tasks. So your core is all of it, and then the interchange between those knowledge and skills is some core knowledge that is applicable to multiple tasks. And that's where you get that lateral movement between roles and responsibilities. So we just need to agree a method of recognizing those type of attributes. If the job is this, don't need all of those certificates. I need to know you're competent doing these 8 things. If you can demonstrate that to me in an interview, then you're in.
So with that, I think we've got a few minutes left. Has anyone in the audience got any questions they'd like to throw at our panelists? Yes, we've got all of them back there. Straight up there with his hat.
So with introducing requirements for like chartership for security professionals, who are we defining as a security professional? The kind of implication so far has kind of been that it's red teamers and pen testers. Would we be looking at this for, well, what part of the question is, would you want this for kind of blue team types as well? Yeah. And actually more broadly, a lot of the talks have spoken about bringing security in at lots of stages of the security life cycle. Does that not, which would imply security being done by a lot of different types of people. Yeah. Does that conflict with the goal that you have a chartership, you're a security professional, or or you're not, I guess?
So more directly, there are 16 domains of knowledge, 16 domains of chartership, which include secure operations, architecture, encryption and cryptography, risk governance, incident response, forensics, includes data management, data logging and systems. It includes manager, almost, not quite maybe the CISO role eventually, who knows? So what they've worked on, and this was a part of the working group, is what are the core component elements of what the cyber ecosystem looks like in terms of skill. So there will be chartered secure operations people, there will be chartered digital forensics experts, there will be chartered incident responders. Incident response, sometimes the language, when they pick the word response, it can involve everybody from the forensics team plus the team plus the plus. So everybody's sort of saying, well, what does that mean? Mostly, it's the ability to lead an exceptionally complex multi-domain response and have the ability to do so, that type of thing. So yes, there are all of those. So secure operations is just starting. Incident response is in track now, and cyber manager is about to come over the hill. So it is not just pen testing. We tend to talk about it, and we have a more common understanding of it, because one of the professions that has the most history of having some structure behind it has been security testing, because of the government and checklink. But yeah, it's not constrained to that.
Anything from you, Chris or Stuart?
I think you're probably better informed about the intricacies of the Cybersecurity Council.
So the other thing I was maybe add to slightly different to just the pure, I guess, surveys. There will be organisations where security may be part of a person who isn't security. Yeah. It might be a CTO or a sysadmin. And there will be challenge there, because you're unlikely to have a chartered security sysadmin if 90% of their job is not kind of security. And we'll need to kind of see where it goes. But obviously, smaller companies will probably rely on partners more for some of the more complex security. Therefore, the expectation might be they look to their partners to say, are you kind of chartered or accredited in that way? But the other thing I think we will expect to see is, insurance, cyber insurance. I don't think it'll be that long before there'll be questions on cyber insurance, questions about who is the professional responsible for cybersecurity, responsible for incident response in your organization. That might be one of the things that starts to drive into organizations in that sense.
And it's important to know, as we were saying about the profession, it's from associates, so, if you're relatively new to it, through a practitioner level, through a principal level, through to a charter level, because you don't need all of the qualities of all of them in all roles. So one of the roles that you come up with, something like, is part of your job responsibility in managing cyber, could be head of IT, there will be a place for you in that structure. It is, but you're absolutely right, not everybody will need one. It has to be proportionate still. It's just a structure which should give some consistency.
That makes sense. We got time for one more question, Kevin?
Hi, I think this is all great. I think this is fantastic and absolutely needed. My question was going to be around, and quite articulated the question, but it's, I think we could get to a stage where we have a lot of professionals who absolutely know what they're doing. When can we, or how could we inject that into technology or CIO leadership kind of roles, so they take that advice on board and act on it? Because my reasoning is they're always balancing business priorities and delivery, and in many roles that I've had, there's always that trade-off, and you may not necessarily get execution on all the great recommendations and best practices that are coming out.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I'd be keen to hear your giving your role.
So I think I kind of touched on there is an element of I'd be interested to see what's available for management. But what we do hear a lot is a real drive for more cyber awareness on the board. So that's a big thing in a lot of organizations, and more cyber awareness at kind of the exec level. And I guess it'll become, well, not that it hasn't already, but the priorities were traditionally balanced because people didn't understand the cyber risk. It was, I can get 4 widgets out and make some money. There's a slight chance of ransom. Now you probably couldn't do risk management in that way. If there's a good chance of ransomware, you've got to be responsible for that. And I guess that's where you'd start to see it'll all be an ecosystem as people are aware of their responsibilities for cyber risk in whatever role they've got. Having a certification or a charter or some level of assurance gives them confidence in their job. It also covers them. Yeah, there's an element going back to the beginning. You will probably be in a much stronger position if/when, because many of us say when in cybersecurity something bad happens, you can say, well, I can demonstrate I was making decisions from a basis of common understanding, as opposed to I just really wanted that product to be released really quickly.
Yeah, and I think it picks up on some of the Brendan and Blake in particular laugh. You know, you got it's still the same proportionality thing. The influencing thing comes out of how does cyber leadership function in its broadest context, and what does that do in terms of those classic fiduciary responsibilities of boards and executive teams? It's easy in a regulated profession to hold them to account because you can point at something. In other places, it's less so. So yes, it is. So work with the Institute of Directors and other bodies to now try and sort of raise the context, because for a lot of businesses that run, say, civil engineering and all the rest of it, they understand the context of their chartered engineers. They understand how that helps them and what that does for them. And this is the journey we've got to go on in cyber, because it's just as important.
There's a possibility I've misunderstood the question you've asked, but one of my concerns is that the certifications that are currently used and mandated for the regulated elements of what we do not assess and test the ability to communicate at board level in that way. The effect of that is that when new people are planning their career path and they're using the syllabi and that pathway as a method of being able to enter the industry, they focus on technical skills because that's what's required. So we end up with a gap there, and that gap gets ameliorated by some firms who require their staff to undertake extra training, but because it's not required, we then go back to the conversation earlier about the certificates possibly measuring the wrong thing. So I think there's absolutely a gap there. I hope that as part of the evolution of the qualifications and the VARCS principle CPD that we talked about earlier, there will be a requirement in the future that professionals operating at that level will have to provide evidence that they can do it. And that expectation that is set will then drive people to undertake whatever training is necessary to achieve that, because people do use certifications as a method of determining their path through the industry at the moment. It's the primary way that new people move through the different roles that exist in this industry. I don't know if that helps, but I might have gone off on a tangent.
But with that, I think it's beer o'clock. Everyone's going to be happy to this. I'll take 2 more minutes done, but I'm clearly a bit excited here. I'll hand over to Scott.
Nick alluded to, we're ending the dry portion of the agenda here today, so I'll be quick. But I appreciate everybody taking the time today to spend time with us. I know everybody's got multiple devices. We're all going to probably be spending this evening as well as tomorrow catching up. This isn't an industry where the messages turn off. So thank you. I'd also like to thank all the speakers. It was great content. And so, thank you very much to my team that's here as well. So round of applause for everybody.
you.